Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. It's Saturday. It's Saturday, which usually means it's the day before a Seahawks game, but in this case, it's just kind of a bye week feel for us here as we get to spend Seahawks Saturday with Jeff Simmons at Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. Jeff, good morning, man. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. We had a long show yesterday, so I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, that was kind of cathartic. I was glad Evan wanted to do that show and you wanted to do that show. I couldn't do the post game show Thursday night for a bunch of reasons, but that was a game we had to kind of rehash a little bit, work through some of our feelings. So
Yeah, I thought Evan was great yesterday. I thought his some of the stuff he said was, and he's on like no sleep across the
mhm.
country, and some of the response has been really good. So that was pretty. I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of folks, well, not a lot of folks, but those of us that have really kind of put ourselves behind this new regime and the new direction, it's open season on us. Everyone's taking shots at the regime, and um, in these moments, I think everything kind of scatters. Fans start pointing fingers. Players can start pointing fingers. Coaches can start pointing fingers. Front office, owners, and I'm kind of amazed how quickly it's devolved into that kind of environment. When the team three pretty bad losses, but the team's still 3-3 after 6 games.
Yeah, and that's where listen, it was the last two games were pretty hard to watch, and they
Mm-hmm.
just looked sloppy and they just looked like a poorly coached football team, and we just haven't seen. We've seen bad things, but we haven't seen them look like this in the last really in a while. And I think just the early expectations had kind of spiraled out of control of what we all were hoping for, or people were just ready to jump on this, and it's starting to get a little out of control with the discourse I'm seeing online, and there's just incorrect facts being spread, and like yesterday, I saw the Seahawks chose Zach Allen. I mean, Draymond Jones over Zach Allen. Actually, the literal opposite of the truth. So it's things are starting. It's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of, but I don't know. I always looked at this next game as the game that it's a big kind of evaluation point for me. So I'm not there. I think it was obviously pretty ugly on Thursday, but I don't know. I'm trying to keep a level head on all this. It's pretty hard right now. Thursday was rough in a lot of ways, but man, it's been hard. It's made me want to get off social media completely.
How do you think? How do you think the Seahawks were in that game? Like, eh, for them to have two chances to take the lead, how is that possible in that game? It felt odd, but it also felt like when it was there, um, it felt it felt like it might even happen.
Yeah, they had a shot. The Chanel kick return for the touchdown kind of really just gave them a second life and kind of brought them back. But you saw how they had a 96-yard drive to go down the field. They got a couple stops when they needed it, and then they're moving the ball before the unfortunate turnover and some of the penalties. And they had two chances to take the lead in that game, which was pretty bizarre. And just anytime you're oh, it's not so bad, and then do something even worse, the run at the end of the game was just painful to watch. Just made that game feel okay, this is not such an embarrassment too. This is a complete embarrassment. And it's just again, a lot of the stuff I think we said about the Niners and a lot of the things we said about the Seahawks, where the talent level doesn't feel as far as it did in the last 2 years. The fact that they were that bad and they had a chance, even though they probably should have fumbled that punt. Um, I think just a lot of our analysis ahead of the time turned out pretty spot on, and the fact that they had a chance to win with all that crap that happened and how bad they played, I think there is some hope. I still have a lot of long-term roster questions, but I do believe a lot of things they're doing wrong are fixable. And even some of the more people who have been tough on the new regime and tougher can see how he's responding, and you saw Jim Mora. I've made that comparison to after the Giants game of how bad it looked. But if if you listen to like Jim Morris speak after some of those games, like you can see he just had no control of what was going on. He was so pissed off. He had, like, did not. There was no leadership coming out of that. Like the time he blames the kicker, and like listening to McDonald speak, and like he's in command, he's in control. Like I think a lot of this is fixable. I know some of like the bigger issues that I pointed out yesterday, maybe not, but I don't know. I still think there's a lot you can come out and be like, okay, we got 10 days to kind of make. And I think what's disappointing of a lot of people about McDonald is they've seemingly had no answers to what's gone wrong in the previous games. And I think there's reasons for that, but I don't know. I'm still not totally out on these guys.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting seeing video of McDonald last night out with Pete Carroll and John Schneider and, Burt Cold and folks. What did you make of that?
I was wondering how uncomfortable that would have been for Pete. Uh, he seemed to I don't know. Him and McDonald seemed to be having a good time chatting, and John was popping in and out of there, and Bird and Jody seemed to be there. And so, yeah, it was kind of nice to have just kind of like a nice moment where everyone's just so down right now. And it kind of brought a smile to my face to see those two kind of chopping it up. And the fact that like everyone's like looking at like this is the worst case scenario. And like, you see, this is just part of the deal. Like, so to see them out together and see them run into each other, I don't know. That was kind of a cool moment where the fan base seems super divided between those two right now. And I don't know. I thought that was just a nice thing to see after it was a pretty rough week around Seahawks time.
Yeah, I think there might not be any better time for them to spend time together. Like,
Seriously.
if somehow they were 6-0 and they met, I think it might be a little bit tough for Pete if, for them to be struggling right now, I think, and for McDonald to be able to have a conversation with a guy that's going to be always optimistic and always see the opportunities and has been through the worst of it in his career as a coach.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully they had a chance to have a couple words and, give him some things to think about, some pearls of wisdom from one of the best to ever do it.
Yeah, the timing. I don't know how much you can get out in like a basketball game or how much you can talk about or how deep they got, but yeah, if there's one time you'd want McDonald to talk to Pete, because McDonald hasn't had, like, I know that we talked about that Miami game, and this is something he just hasn't seen. Michigan was pretty smooth for him. Baltimore, they had such good players, and they were able to get that scheme figured out once they got Roquan Smith figured out. That thing to move pretty quickly. So this is a whole new challenge with all kinds of things going on with DK and Geno and defense problems. And so if there's one guy you'd want him to consult in a moment like this, Pete, him running into Pete's pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it wasn't an accident, but, we talked about it just at tail end of the show yesterday about how many, 49ers fans were there, how many people gave up their seats. I've talked about it even before this first game of the season. There were empty seats. We're seeing ads on buses around here for single game tickets before the season even started. It really does feel like the fan base is as disengaged coming into the year, let alone once things start going the wrong way, as it's been for a while. And obviously you and I have a different front row seat. We've got these amazing folks in chat and tuning into the show. Every single day, hundreds, thousands of people are tuning in. I'm talking to folks about the Seahawks, and obviously there's disappointment right now, but what do you think's going on? Like, what is it? Is it NFL? Is it just Seattle, or you think the NFL more broadly is experiencing some of these challenges, maybe in stadium?
I think it's a little Seattle driven, and I always say this, and I know for years there'd been this Pete Carroll versus Russell fight going on online, but my biggest thing I always said is social media, especially Twitter, does not represent the masses. And I always kind of joke that we had this whole Pete Carroll versus the Russ thing, and you go online, it's this tense environment. And I think if you walked around the streets of Seattle and kind of asked the state of Pete Carroll the last 7 years, I'm guessing you would have got a completely different answer. If you ask people about this Pete versus Russ thing, like 4 years ago, I bet like so many people would not have known this is even going on. So you get caught up in these bubbles online and you see like the analytics wars and all this stuff. It takes over your brain and like you think this is what everyone's thinking about. And then you've talked to some dude at work who like barely is a casual fan and they don't have a clue with what you're talking about. So I think we've been so wrapped up in this little bubble for years. But I think for the casuals, Russ is gone. Now Pete's gone. The team's been mid for a long time now. I just don't think there's for the average casual fan, I don't think there's the thing driving them to here. And like you have to be pretty like football in that bubble to like know about McDonald and know about like the scheme lord. He's not like if you brought in Jim Harbaugh, like I know you would have hated, but I think from a massive standpoint, I think someone like that can be a very like polarizing but force to like really intrigues like the average fan. And a lot of people probably don't know who Mike McDonald is. He's kind of vanilla when he speaks. Geno Smith, I think we're seeing pretty clearly. I don't think he's the guy that's kind of getting. He's a great story, but I think for the average fan, they either think Geno sucks or he's just a stopgap. And again, in that bubble, if you read Robert Mays or you read Mina, Geno's like a totally different. He's one of their favorite players to watch. So I think we're at this point now where like there's no like attraction. If you ask the average person about the Seahawks, they'd be like, they're fine. Like I don't think there's either the player from standpoint or the coach that kind of draws them in. And I think it's got to this point where we're in this world where me and you and Evan, we're so excited for the season. We're so excited to see something new. I don't think the average person, and again, the average person is not the everyday people we're talking to online. I don't think it's there right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jeff, because I mean, last night, I don't know what your rituals are when you're down on the Seahawks and things are just bumming you out, but like, I try to get away from it as much as I can. Obviously, doing a daily show and covering the team full time makes it a little harder than it used to be, but I'm not on Twitter nearly as much. But like my bedtime ritual, once I've got my kid in bed, and I'm ready to go to sleep, I just scroll TikTok for a while, try to laugh, try to get my mind off things. And sure enough, I like keep running into all these Seahawk or 49er or whatever related videos. And one was Marshawn Lynch kind of reacting to seeing the seismic activity during his run. And he was getting emotional about how much he loves Seattle and loves Seahawks fans. Then I see a video of someone saying, I miss my quarterback, and it's all these Russell Wilson highlights. And that's, I think, the kind of state of things is like, I texted you guys last night. When you talk about that era, everyone talks about it as the LOB team. And I think that's appropriate. It was the best defense maybe of a generation. Then you talk about Russell Wilson, Russ and what he meant to the city and what he meant to the franchise. You probably talk about Pete Carroll, and Marshawn Lynch, obviously, like no one will say like he wouldn't be like way down on the list, but he's not one of the first two things. And that guy was like a heart of this team. Mm-hmm. And I think you could have had the LOB, you could have had Pete Carroll, you could have had Russell Wilson. If you didn't have Marshawn Lynch on that team, I don't think they win a ring. And I don't think they're the same team that they were. And so the reason I'm bringing all that up is a few things. One, I think people loved Marshawn Lynch. People loved Russell Wilson. People loved Pete Carroll. And if you even go back to 2011, I mean, Marshawn Lynch did Beastquake in 2010, first year. And he was traded for midseason, and like kind of worked his way in, but wasn't beloved until that moment. Matt Hasselbeck was still there at the beginning. They did win a playoff game in kind of a dramatic fashion. But there weren't a lot like, it felt like they were building something, but it felt like, I don't know, they hadn't won a Super Bowl yet. There was still this innocence to the Seahawks fan base of just like, there no matter what. And then you start adding, the Richard Shermans, the Doug Baldwins, you start adding the Bobby Wagners, you start adding better play and Russell Wilson. And it felt like there were so many players to love, and it wasn't just that they were a good team. I think there was personalities and other things that I think really people connected with. And so that's one part. And the other part is I just don't know that there's those kinds of people that command that kind of respect in and out of the locker room there. And so, and I think it's been a while. I don't think this is a Mike McDonald thing at all.
No.
I think it's been even before Russ. Well, for some people, maybe it was when Russ left, but I just don't think that there's players left over that people love or are close to loving.
Yeah, like superstars sell. And it's just that's how sports works. Like think of all these NBA teams that don't have. I know it's obviously a sensitive subject, bring up the NBA right now, but there's so many NBA teams that are just kind of going through the motions, like the Atlanta Hawks right now. And it's like if you talk about like, I don't want to compare the Seahawks to one of those NBA teams, but I'll tell you my experience. I covered the Bills. The Bills did a lot of stuff in Toronto. We saw it from the Seahawks when I was working in the media. And I sent you a screenshot of what the records were yesterday of those teams. And now you hear in the media about Bills Mafia and how crazy their fans are. And I can tell you, I covered those teams 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. So I'm a bit in 2015. I was at the facility. I was at some games. I was at the draft party, like things like that. This Bills Mafia you hear about was not so big when Josh Allen wasn't there. Like they had a team that they were definitely a little worse off than the Seahawks were, but their superstars were like Ryan Fitzpatrick, Fred Jackson, Stevie Johnson, like decent players at the time. But it felt similar to what you're seeing in Seattle. And it's not like the fans all of a sudden are like fair weather fans. And it's just, you need stars to sell a team. It's part of the sports. It's part of the deal. That Seahawks team had not only like they were amazing as a team, but like they had a unique amount of stars. Russell and Marshawn and Sherman and Cam. Like who couldn't love Cam Chancellor? And like Bobby Wagner, when those other guys went away and it was just Bobby. As much as I love Bobby, I don't think he was ever looked at as that superstar. And I love Bobby Wagner, first ballot Hall of Famer, but just something about those personalities and what they do to sell a team. And like, it's just so different. And I saw it in Buffalo. Now you see this Bills Mafia is this like well-regarded, crazy fan base, like going nuts on tailgates, impossible to get tickets. It wasn't like that when they weren't so good. So I'm not saying that's what's going on in Seattle, but I think the Russell and then Pete leaving, they're kind of just that team that's kind of going through the motions. They have a lot of young players that like the hardcores really like, but there's no, again, we talked about the other day, there's no greatness on this team right now. There's no player that like you're putting a poster on your wall if you're an 8-year-old. Like, I don't know if that's who you bring your kid to see right now. Is like Devin Witherspoon, the guy like no one's really throwing at. Like it's really tough. Like they don't have like DK is the closest thing, but DK's been so polarizing and so up and down. And we talked enough about him yesterday. I don't think he's quite there. And I think that kind of sums up where this team is right now.
Yeah. I mean, I look at the early years of when I was here in '97, when I first came here out of school and bought tickets and was in the Kingdom, and it was Holmgren's first year. Actually, that was, I think Holmgren was maybe the next year, but in either way, the franchise had barely had any division titles, let alone playoff victories. I don't think they had won a playoff game since like the mid '80s. And, you know, there was, I mean, at that point, I think it was John Kitna and, you know, Warren Moon might have been there. I can't remember. But like, as Mike Holmgren came in, he almost got fired. Like he was gonna be fired as both coach and GM. He ended up just giving up his GM duties. And during that time, the Seahawks had Matt Hasselbeck at that point already. They had Corin Robinson and you know, they had Walter Jones and
Sean
Steve
Alexander.
Hutchinson. They had Sean Alexander. And they're still like, the city was attending games, but there just wasn't the fervor, you know, that you get when you win. And I remember moments where they'd make a play. I felt like I could see what they were building, and you're like, okay, this is when the city falls in love, and it just took a while. Like it takes.
Yeah.
The only way to get there is through winning.
Yeah.
But even, I guess the point I'm making here is, even during those kind of mediocre times, they were still filling the stadium. They were still, enjoying the games. And so something feels, I don't know if it's just the prices have gotten so high. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's other stuff. Maybe like once you've had the winning, like you've won the Super Bowl, maybe it's harder, but it's a different issue right now. And what do you think needs to happen? Like, what's a realistic set of things that could happen for them to start getting back on the winning side against what's going to be tough competition?
So I think the first thing they have to figure out is the run defense. And and in terms of like a little different, obviously winning the fan base over, but I think if their run defense is like this, they're gonna struggle in every single game. And we saw it last year, how the games against that horrible Tennessee team that was basically a CFL team, and they barely hung on to win that game. So if they can't figure out this run defense and at least make an adjustment somewhere, whether it's player switching, whether it's scheme, whether it's because what the linebackers and safeties are doing and Draymond Jones is doing on the edge, they're just struggling. So that's the biggest way they can stop. Because I think if that stops, I think everything else can kind of come together. Because the run defense has just blown up these last two games so way where it's just giving them no chance. Because I think another chance is, like, obviously there was a big pass to Julian Love that Julian Love whiffed on that looks horrible in hindsight, but I think that they didn't play like in a lot of situations you talked about. They played pretty decent run defense. It was just getting those big plays out of there. So I think if they can get that at least under control to a level that's not a joke like it was the last 2 weeks, and I think that gives them a shot because I think defensively, I think enough pieces are there that they should definitely be competent. There's no reason for them to be this bad. And again, some of it's coaching, some of it's players, some of it is a staff that hasn't really worked together. And I was talking to one of the guys who kind of helps me online, and I was talking about Dan Quinn. And Dan Quinn, their defense is actually ranked horrible. A lot of people are like, well, they're the 13th scoring defense. If you actually look at the numbers, they're actually horrible. They're like the third worst defense based on like every advanced metric. But the thing with Dan Quinn's staff is it's very aligned. Like the DC he worked with in Dallas, Joe Witt. Ken Norton's the linebacker coach. The D-line coach is Daryl Tapp. Actually, they were together in the Seattle. And I looked at this last night. That's why I know this. So when things get ugly, like these guys know they're working together. They've worked together. The thing about McDonald is the staff he's put together, and I don't think this is a knock on him, but this is something we kind of talked about in the offseason. None of these guys have worked together.
Mm-hmm.
So if the linebacker room and the DB room and the D-line room, are they all being coached the same? Like, this is a scheme that none of these coaches have ever worked in before. Chris Partridge, I think, is the only coach that's really worked with McDonald before. And so that was a thing that, like, we were kind of concerned about. But I wonder, like, on film, is that why, like, the whole defense kind of looks disjointed right now, where they're talking about how the D-line's winning? Like, the D-line's been good, or it just might be a personnel thing. So I wonder about, like, that's why I think this is such an important week where you can take those position groups. And again, like we saw with Pete went through the first year, and I looked at this up today. So in week, obviously the roster was a lot worse at the time, but week 7 and 8 in Pete's first year, they lost 33-3 to a bad Raiders team, and they lost 41-7 to the Giants. And that was a much worse roster, so don't get me wrong. But after that Raiders game, Pete in his mind said that our team's too soft. I'm going to have to make a staff change. He hired Tom Cable, who was the head coach of that team, who got fired. And Tom Cable's obviously looked at horribly. But the reason he hired him was we need to get tougher. And then he fired Jeremy Bates. He redid the thing. So Pete, who had the best run in franchise history, kind of went through this where his staff was a lot more aligned coming out, all the USC guys. But McDonald's staff was kind of built up of some of Schneider's guys, some of his contacts. So he's never worked with Grubb before. And so this 10-day period is where like they need to get that. And that's where you worry, like, does he have the alignment inside right now? Are they all working together? And that's the thing, like, I think this period is so important because when things go wrong, you need to have those guys you can rely on, everyone coaching the same way. And I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I think that's what makes this so interesting. And what that's why I think, like, even if the worst case happens, I think he'd get a second chance to rebuild his staff. But that's the thing I'm wondering about, and that's, I think, a huge deal coming into this mini buy.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, Jeff. And we talked about that during the lead up, that it's kind of an all-star staff of, Kennedy Palomalu is renowned as a running back coach. You've got Grubb, Huff have made their names for themselves separately. You've got obviously Leslie Frazier. You've got, Carl Brooks is even, generally very highly regarded as a DB coach. Kind of go all the way through, and there's a lot of pretty well regarded coaches on that staff. Even Jake Peets, the passing game coordinator coming out of McVay's room. But they hadn't, like, it's one thing to come in as a new coach in a new regime and learn a roster and figure out who's your guys and how to build that. But to also do that while you're figuring out your coaches and how that's going to work it's kind of 4D chess. So that's what they chose. And I don't know that they had a much different option. It's not like McDonald's got this huge Rolodex of guys that he's worked with for years and relationships he's built up. But that's part of what, the human side of this is figuring out how to navigate all that. And so I kind of look at it, and you say it looks like it looks like a poorly coached team. And I don't know that I see things like, we haven't said that it looked like a poorly coached team under Pete in the last few years, but it looks similar. Like, I think so for me, I don't quite get to the poorly coached, but I think ultimately, if you keep having the same problems and they're not changing, then that's a coaching issue. Like, there's got to be something you can do to stem the tide. And last thing I'll say before getting to the super chat is there was one play in particular that the 49ers were running early on with tons of success. It was like a toss crack kind of play, and they kept running it over and over again. They were getting like 8 yards of play on it. Like, why not? And then they adjusted. Jerome Baker made a great hit. I think Draymond Jones or Jaron Reed scraped down. Like, they stopped that play, and the 49ers stopped having success with that play. And when I look at the run numbers play by play, there were a number of things that they did meaningfully better in this game. They actually played some different fronts that had some different success. But none of that matters if you still have these issues. And I think what you heard from McDonald was it wasn't the same issues. It was the same result, but it wasn't the same issues. And so it's got to be so aggravating to be playing whack-a-mole there, and not having the time to really do much about it. So you're right. I think this is the stretch where they're going to have an opportunity to hopefully do something about that. Let's get the super chat from MG Slicker. Says, I think a big problem is that certain players being on the field are a big tell when they pass or run. Example, Tyler Lockett on the field, pass. Jake Bobo on the field, run. It's a good point. I haven't noticed that. Have you noticed that at all, Jeff?
No, but I guess to the point you made yesterday, when San Francisco comes out in a pretty heavy run personnel and they're running and it's working, I'm not sure of that, or like when the Seahawks used to do it. I think that's a symptom of a bigger problem. I think that's part of the issue, and I think that right now the offense looks super disjointed in the last 2 games. I think they're still trying to figure out who they are. There's been really, it's kind of looked like the Shane Waldron's problem, where it's like, if you're bad at the line of scrimmage and you want to be a run team, but you really aren't designed to be one, but this year they're not play actioning and they can drop back really well. And they kind of haven't figured out who they are yet. They don't look like the Washington offense we saw from Ryan Grubb. They do some of the motions, but the route combinations look kind of meh, and it looks a little vanilla at times. So I think there's bigger issues than that. But yeah, dictating your plays based on personnel, not great. But I think that's a symptom of a bigger problem.
So obviously we'll have a chance to talk ahead of the Atlanta game. Although I'm going to be at Oktoberfest that weekend, so our Seahawks Saturday maybe more entertaining than expected. Maybe I'll be out on the streets. But what I don't have a lot of as much as I actually think the Seahawks have a chance to turn this around and get back on the track. I've looked at that game as a loss from the beginning of the season, well before all this. I just thought it
Me too.
bad setup. I think it's a tough place. Gino does do well in domes, so maybe there's that. But I mean, Byron Murphy coming back gives me some hope that that'll be helpful. I do think he is a difference maker. What what's the reason to be hopeful about that game?
Hopeful is it's the kind of quarterback where if they're actually getting pressures, they can actually affect Kirk Cousins. He doesn't move very well. Purdy moved exceptionally well. Daniel Jones moved exceptionally well. They're not like a great just run the ball dead at you. They're a scheme that the Seahawks should be familiar with McVay, but they have a lot of scary weapons and they can pass. They're a much more dangerous passing team, I think, than anything else, and I think that doesn't hurt Seattle as much as the really more dangerous run teams. And defensively, they don't have a lot of like disruptors in the line of scrimmage. Like they have Matthew Judon and Grady Jarrett, still pretty good players, but they don't have like the Bosa, Dexter Lawrence that just is going to screw their game up. And so this offense, I think, could be kind of potent against them. They don't have a great defense. You saw Tampa Bay just move the ball up and down against them. So I think this is a game that does play into Seattle's kind of strengths and weaknesses a lot better. Where I picked the Niners to win by 10 points because I thought the matchup and the stuff that I was worried about matched up so poorly with their weaknesses. I think Atlanta actually matches up really well with what they're good at, and what Atlanta's good at, I think, kind of matches up with what Seattle's good at. So I think there is a shot, or I think it's going to be a lot harder to embarrass them. Obviously, they have a great running back. They have a pretty good offensive line, so they could just line up and run the ball. Then that game will probably feel as hopeless as the last two felt. So, but if it becomes like a heavy passing game, kind of like what we thought the Detroit game would be, and they don't have the power players Detroit has, they're much more finesse. I think this is the kind of game I actually think they are matched up, built to play in right now.
Well, that's a good at least entree for the conversation. They play at Carolina this week, which is going to be they're going to come out of that game with a lot of confidence, most likely, and so we'll see. We'll see if how that like most people will look at that and say if they beat Atlanta, they'll be like, well, Atlanta's not that big of a win. I think you and I both feel like I don't think they're going to win in Atlanta. Maybe I'll dig in and I'll have reasons that I feel differently once I start really reviewing, but I didn't expect them to win Atlanta before this 3-game streak. I'm not clearly seeing why I would think they're going to win in Atlanta now. So if they do win that game, I think it'll be a big deal. I think it would be a really big deal. And it'll depend on how they win as well. But any way that they could win that game would be significant because then they come home for 2. And even though Buffalo and the Rams, they present their own challenges, then all of a sudden the season, to your point, starts to have potential again. But if they lose that game 4 in a row, it starts to the walls start closing in real fast.
Mm-hmm. People start looking at the draft calculators.
I thought about it for today, dude. It's the first time all season I'm like, I actually want to watch some college football because I want to start figuring out who we should take. So with that, I want to let you go. A little bit shorter show today. I got to get Nate up and ready for his day, but I really appreciate you at Real Jeff Simmons for coming on this morning. I appreciate everyone that tuned in. It's amazing. Even though, Jeff, there are fans not coming to games, there's still thousands of folks tuning into the show, and I think that that's amazing. So appreciate folks tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I will be back tomorrow with another show. We've got a super chat that, before I go, that says, DK didn't get ejected for fighting is a step in the right direction. Last couple of years felt like we couldn't even compete with San Francisco. Turning of the tides is coming. I actually agree. I thought that this was a game where it was very clear that these two teams were much There's much less separating them than there had been before. And that's why I feel, and I will say it again, if the Seahawks do start to play better football and make less stupid mistakes and show like a little bit more positive direction, if they could get Abe Lucas back after the bye, which would be nice, when they play San Francisco, I'm not marking that as a loss automatically. I think that's a game Seattle can be competitive in if they can get some of these other things fixed, because they were competitive in a game when they did so many things poorly. I think it wouldn't have been that competitive in past years. All right, folks. Thank you so much. I'm Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at HawkBlogger. This has been episode 202 of HawkBlogger Mornings. Take care, y'all.